Funziona? Sì. Ciao a tutti, grazie per essere qua. Ringrazio Annelys De Vet che è qua con noi. E due parole, giusto per introdurla. Annelys De Vet è graphic designer, è attivatrice e curatrice di diversi progetti, lavora tra Bruxelles e Amsterdam ed è capo del Dipartimento di Design del Sandberg Instituut, nello specifico il Master Retail Academy. Il suo lavoro esplora il ruolo del design in relazione alla sfera pubblica e politica. È fondatrice dello studio Bureau De Vet, sempre con sede a Bruxelles. È cofondatrice e designer di alcuni progetti che oggi ci mostrerà, tra i quali Disarming Palestine, che è un progetto di design che sviluppa e presenta e vende anche prodotti utili provenienti dal contesto palestinese, reinterpretati attraverso la chiave del design, e un grandissimo progetto che è Subjective Atlas, del quale sta tenendo anche il workshop con i ragazzi del biennio in editoria, che sono, per definirli brevemente, una serie di atlanti che mappano paesi, regioni e entità sociopolitiche partendo da significati personali che gli stessi partecipanti ai workshop che lei mette in funzione producono, diciamo, sono gli stessi produttori di contenuti. E niente, io passerei direttamente la parola a Annelys. If you want to start.
Okay.
I'll be there. Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much, Matteo and Jonathan, for the invitation to speak here tonight. I hope I will not speak too quick, but I don't have a talent for slow speaking. So please do interrupt me when I go too fast or if there's a translation needed. I'm very excited to be in Urbino, particularly because it's my first time here and I'm very overwhelmed by the city and also by the school and by the commitment of the students. And we had a really wonderful and inspiring day. And tonight I will talk a bit more about my own practice. This is my house, or it's part of my house. Behind it is my studio. And so from there I live in the countryside, just very close to Brussels. Although I am Dutch, but I moved to Belgium 10 years ago. First to Brussels and now to Sint-Pietersleeuw, where this farm is, and where we also have animals and a vegetable garden, and trying to investigate maybe in different ways of living or more conscious ways of living or experiment with ways of living. Besides that, I'm also head of the design department of the Sandberg Instituut, which is the Masters of the Rietveld Academy in Amsterdam, and I will tell something about this department. Actually, myself, I also studied there and I graduated there in 1999. I'm the founder of the Subjective Atlas Editions, where I also will speak something about, and then also the founder of Disarming Design from Palestine, an inclusive design label with products from Palestine that speak of Palestine's current reality, where you just heard some music from. It was Marcel Khalif singing a text of Mahmoud Darwish, one of the most famous Palestinian poets. And besides that, I have a studio which I call a studio for gentle power and radical imagination. So I think the motivation or the passion or the strength to set up things maybe is the core of the practice, which I thought is interesting in seeing this image. On the left is my son. And besides him is Wissam Horani, a Palestinian refugee who was living with us for 1.5 years and now found asylum in Belgium, and a friend. And then I would love to see these practice or these ways of working as an intellectual playground, or to really to experiment things and to sometimes have a goal, but sometimes not have a goal, but have an urge instead of a solution. So these are the tutors of the Sandberg Instituut that I invite every year to come over to the farm to discuss the whole curriculum. Now they're walking through sticky needles. And this is the design department of the Sandberg Instituut, which is a 2 years master's. In the Netherlands, bachelor is 4 years and a master's is 2 years education. And we call it the think tank for visual strategies. I love to see it as a trust-based educational model. So trust is the starting point. It means that people have 24-hour access to the building, but also that they come to our department means that we really trust their talents, and we don't want to check it, but we want to enlarge it and catalyze it. And also that like we don't have assignments. We stimulate people to do self-initiated projects, and we stimulate people to design about things that they care about, or maybe to discover what they care about through design. So therefore, I think that the notion of trust is really important in order to also to experiment, to fail, to be vulnerable, and to really figure out like where do you stand and what do you find important to work on. This is an image of again my house, where I invite all the students at the first week of the year. I invite all the students in the house to come and to get to know each other better, and also in a different context. And I'm interested in education taking place outside institutional paths. So often, if I think in my own learning or academic history, and maybe if you can do that by yourself also, like what were the most learningful moments, or what were the moments that you were really touched by a new insight? Often it's not kind of the institutional moments, but the dinner you have after a full day, or the meeting you have on an unexpected moment. All of a sudden, that's the moment often where new ideas arise or new experiences arise. And I'm interested, like, in how can an educational model or an education stimulate these kind of moments. So it's about the unpredictability of where design can lead you. And I think maybe the core responsibility of education is to generate curiosity, to make you curious, and curiosity is a force or an engine that can bring you further, to can follow you after certain topics and subjects. So I think it's nice to see education also as a desire, as something. How can you organize education that it works as a desire, as something that you want to explore, work further on? And this image is also the tutors of the Sandberg Instituut. So in a way, we don't educate program followers, but we want to educate program makers. We don't give theory and fixed theory, but it's research. People find out their own theories and dive into the topics that they are very interested in. But then research is given as a way to make. So how can you discover new knowledge? Through the act of making. How can you use the act of making of doing research? So research is not like academic research or written text that you reflect upon, but it's also an interaction with people. It's also an experience. It's also to make things. And by making, you get a lot of new knowledge. And how can education facilitate these kind of processes? And so we don't give assignments, but we try to trigger students to take initiative. Thank you. So it's not a fixed program, but a responsive program. So depending on the response of the students and the topics that they bring in, the program is also reflexive and fluid to grow together with the students, which makes us as an education sometimes vulnerable, because we're also subject for complaints or for other things, also because we don't give a fixed thing. It's also a proposal, which you also need to give something back in return. But if things are being given back, then kind of you get the full value of such a program, and it can really catalyze your standpoints and your own interests. So design is not as we used to think about design. Design is more seen as a mentality, like how to deal with things, how to look at things, how can you translate topics that you're interested in through design. So maybe when people graduate, they don't graduate even though they make things to graduate. What they really graduate on is their practice, or maybe they design their own practice, they design their own DNA as a designer, like where do you stand, and how can the education make you aware of where you want to stand and how to set up a practice after graduation. So design is seen as an emancipatory tool, like how to use design as a way to be more independent and to emancipate yourself. And I love to see design as poetic forms of resistance to values that you do not agree with, or resistance to ways of, or resistance to ways you want to deny, but poetry to imagine other things and other values. So design is seen as a tool to deal with reality. The reality is very complex, but through making something, you have a topic that you can hold on and can dive into and can explore further. So the designer is maybe not a designer anymore, but a storyteller, or perhaps a facilitator, someone who makes things possible, or perhaps a host and being very hospitable to other people to collaborate or to act in certain scripts. But most often we see that the designer becomes a collective. There's less and less individuals, and there's more and more joint forces, and that's something that we definitely want to stimulate through education. All the images that you saw were actually photos of the last year's graduation show of the department. Is the beep annoying? No, it's okay. Go for it. So maybe if you think of an emancipatory process through design, then you also think about citizenship, and how can you be a conscious citizen or a critical citizen, or be aware of citizenship, which relates to a community or to a country, and how can design play a role in that's better. How can design play a role in the consciousness of citizenship and of collective processes? And that's something that myself, I'm wondering in my own practice. What does citizenship mean, and how can design create an understanding of a more critical citizenship? So one of the things that I do is the subjective atlas editions. The students who were today, they've seen it extensively, so I go a bit quick through this project. So the subjective atlases are books that map countries or regions from inside out. So often an atlas is also always an outsider perspective, and this is an insider perspective with local artists and architects, photographers, designers. We map a certain region. So currently we work in Brussels. This was last Thursday. So it's developing a subjective atlas of Brussels at this moment. We're finishing a subjective atlas of Pakistan, where we had a workshop, and Colombia already made. And so I give you a quick insight in the book. So the visual is really important. So it's the image that speaks, and the text is only a credit. And the atlases are ways to deal with otherness, or ways to deal with people in another community, but through their personal stories, they relate to your own values and your own stories. So they're not another, but they are like you. So this is a subjective atlas of Mexico. Here's a subjective atlas of Hungary. And constantly, so each image, each contributions is made by an individual there, a citizen, who reflects on his own environment and see like how can the personal experience be related to the political values? How can my relationship with my neighbor tell something about the relationships in the country and as a whole? And all these contributions touch upon these kind of topics. And this is a subjective atlas of Hainaut. So like all kind of bricks, people who live in a neighborhood. There's a lot of people who hold doves. You see it? Subjective atlas of Colombia. And so it's mapping houses, streets, people, their feelings, their roots, their work, a walk, the issues that they deal with. And each time it's based on a workshop, and I go there, or for instance, the subjective atlas of Colombia, it's two friends of mine who did all the workshops. One is Colombian. And it's diving into like what are the issues at stake and how can we visualize them, and on this way have the individual offer a platform for the individual to speak about his or her own values that are often rather marginalized, and also in this way to show an inclusive way of identity, an inclusive way of how to deal with a nation or with an environment. And this is the Subjective Atlas of Palestine that I made in 2007, and that has a tremendous influence on my practice, because after going to Palestine, where at first I wasn't aware of the situation there, but by going there and by meeting the artist and seeing the reality, it completely changed my view on occupation, on news, on propaganda, on global politics, and just by being there, immediately understand things that is really hard to understand from a distance. And then this proximity is something that the atlases try to reach, to offer this curiosity, this understanding, and this opportunity to relate to certain topics. So these atlases are visual dialogues on identity, and they map certain phenomena. They are a collective tool to unsettle and challenge social, political, cultural, and economic ideas and prejudices. And then the atlas is not just the things that's being designed, it's the whole process that's being designed. So design is the script. The design itself is actually the design of the whole process of the organizational model, and how do people interact, how do people make things, how do we edit it, how do we respect their voices, how do we make sure that they feel well represented in the book, how does it come together, so how can it be at one side a collective voice, and at the other time also have a clear structure that it doesn't disappear in 1,000 voices. So this is a bit how it works, that someone is asking for a subjective atlas, then we get, I offer the structure of how to make the atlas, then people try to find funding, a cultural institute, and this cultural institute invites the artists to participate, and then the artists that participate, or designers, architects, photographers, they have the freedom to say what they want to say. So there's a freedom of them to express their own voice. So on each level of this process, each time the autonomy is given to the next person, and at the same time the previous person is responsible for who's invited, and I'm responsible for who's taking the initiative. And so each time kind of this responsibility is both shared as given to the next one, and then on the end put together in one book where all are owners of, or authors of. So right now it's a series of 10 subjective atlases, and the 11th one is the Subjective Atlas of Brussels. And I'm now starting a publishing house with a friend and a website that should have been online, but it will be later on this week. It's subjectiveatlas.info, and here you can find more about each atlas. Oh, it doesn't work now. And also, like, who's writing about it, what happened with it. There's an exhibition. There's because all the atlases are printed under Creative Commons with the aim that the images are being reproduced in other platforms. Because each atlas is printed in an edition of like 2,000 or 3,000 books, which is quite a limited audience. But the moment an image is being reproduced on the daily journal, where maybe 5 million people are watching, or it's in a newspaper where millions of people are seeing the newspaper, the images are reaching other audiences, but not through the book, but the book was needed in order to create these images. So I'm interested in also thinking what is the distribution of these images, and how can you stimulate different ways of distribution. But I do believe that making is important to get these images, that if we do not make the book, it's hard to get these images together and to let it float on other platforms. So the aim is to change, to sensibilize the view on our societies, on otherness, and on identity. So I'm curious, like, how can design help to imagine a different future? And how can we use design as a tool to engage with the outside world? How can we use design to bridge otherness? So how can design be a way to relate to someone that otherwise you find hard to relate with, or by making a project? Or today also students were talking about interviews they conducted with people they didn't know yet. So by setting up a project is also kind of an excuse to get in contact with the other people, and it's a way to bridge otherness or to do something in other communities, in other places, in other regions, or in other schools. So design is not just the final product, but it's also a tool to make other things take place or let other things happen. And how to find collective authorship. And what function can creative practices have in situations of conflict? So for instance, Palestine, a creative practice has a completely different impact than a creative practice here in Urbino. And like how to deal with that? What is the political reality in which the design or the image exists? And how as a designer can you relate to this meaning? And how can you navigate through it? And how can you, for instance, in Palestine, anything you do relates to the political reality because it's a politicized society. So everything you make relates to that narrative. And so how do you deal with that? And what can then, in a politicized society also means that that the debate is kind of locked. And for instance, with Palestine, on a political level, or also on a human level, it's a disaster. And on a political level, there's no place for hope, or there's no place for change to take place soon. So there the debate is completely fixed, and there's or locked, and there's no space for change. Well, if you look to an artistic practice, then that's the place for fantasy, for humor, for imagination, and there is place to create otherness, to create imagination, to think on other ways about problems that might seem unsolvable, but through a creative practice you can imagine other realities. And how can you use design to give platform to marginalized voices? So for instance, also with the subjective atlases, people speak in those atlases or speak through visual contributions, but those voices they're not being quoted in the newspapers, or they are like how can design be used as a tool to amplify those voices, or to find, or to what you design, that you see that as a platform to give voice to other people's voices, and to who and how to do that. And and for me, I find it, after being in Palestine, like one thing that really struck me is that at one side, what I was seeing there, I couldn't imagine before, and then afterwards I told it to people and they didn't believe me. And I said, but I've seen it. And, well, we don't believe you. You've been subject to propaganda, or you've seen it wrong. So it's very hard, in a way, particularly to talk about Palestine, that people they have such a strong prejudices. So it's very hard to go beyond that, or to find another angle to deal with this reality, or to show the reality. So with the subjective atlas, and then also with this design label, I'm really interested in like, how can we spread alternative, and then I mean human and cultural narratives about the situation in Palestine, on a way that people are not completely or not directly called upon the prejudice that they already have. So how to develop knowledge through the act of designing in a conflicted reality. So by designing in Palestine, you also learn a lot of new things. Can the organizational structure of a design also be seen? Can the organizational structure of a project also be seen as the design? So the design is not the thing itself, but the whole structure, and then how to design that. And how can the act of making be used as an emancipatory tool? How to empower through the act of making? And how to organize trust? So these are questions that are apparent for setting up Disarming Design from Palestine. So this is an inclusive design label that develops, produces, and distributes contemporary designs from Palestine that speak about its current reality. And it started 7 years ago when I was asked by a Dutch organization, Dutch NGO, and they approached me and said, hey, there's so many beautiful products made in Palestine, but they're not available on the Dutch/international market. Can you think of a way of doing something with those products? And then I thought, well, those products are by itself rather good. Maybe what I can do is actually curate the context in which they are being presented. So I propose to start a design label. So then the label is kind of the context, and then in the label are all kind of products that relate to each other, and together they can tell a bigger narrative. And also for a shop or for a platform, it's nicer to have a whole label than just one product. And then my experience with the design, with the making the subjective atlas of Palestine and working together with the art school in Ramallah, I was really impressed by the quality of the artist and the way of artistic thinking. So I wanted to set up this design label together with the art school in Ramallah, and I approached Khaled Hourani, it's a Palestinian artist with who I made the subjective atlas of Palestine. And I asked him, like, would you like to set up a design label together with the students of the art school in Ramallah and the students of the Sandberg Instituut? As I thought for the students of the Sandberg Instituut, it would be an amazing experience to see the reality in Palestine and to work together with colleagues, with designers in Palestine. And then, like, on a professional level, you have the same interest, but on a daily level, you live a completely different reality. And also through the act of collaborating, you start to understand each other. And so this is how it started. And so in the last 7 years, each year we've been able to organize a workshop. So this is in East Jerusalem in 2015. Actually also in Gaza in 2015. I went there and worked with artists in Gaza and artisans. This is in 2016 in Ramallah. And last year we were in Jordan, and we worked together with the Palestinian refugee camp in Jerash. And this is also in Jordan last October. And then, so here you see, for instance, on the right is a student from the Sandberg Instituut. On the left, it's a Jordanian designer, and on the left, it's a guy, a carpenter who lives in the refugee camp. And these two people the two designers were collaborating, and now they're explaining the artisan, like, can you make it like this, or how to do it, and then later he made it, and then they changed it, and then he made it, and they changed it, and finally a product comes out. So together with the participants of the workshop, we investigate in the available production processes. So for instance, there's a lot of ceramic, there's carpentry, there's a lot of olive wood, there's tailors, there's textile making, there's metal, and there's a big leather industry, there's leather tailors. So with these techniques, it also tells something about the history of the place, and sometimes also of the identity of the source, of the location, because it's, for instance, ceramic sometimes is made with the soil, the local soil, or the leather comes from Palestinian animals, or like where the olive wood comes from olive trees, local. So like how to deal with the resources, the possibilities of making, and how can we use traditional or existing production processes but with contemporary designs. So this is what they do during the workshop. In the end of the workshop, there's prototypes that we show with a larger audience, also to see the different responses, like how are products being read, what do they tell, what do they mean inside Palestine, what do they mean outside Palestine, is something offensive, is it okay to use this kind of joke, or kind of to really check how the different products work. So I'll show you a few of the products that we make. So this is Beyond First Impression by Khadir Dajani. She's a Palestinian designer living in Jerusalem. And for her, what's very apparent is that, particularly in Jerusalem, there's a lot of... Jerusalem used to be completely Palestinian, but then in 1948, the state of Palestine, of the state of Israel, was set up, and a lot of houses that were at that time first from Palestinian owners were confiscated by new Israeli citizens, and then in 1967, with the Six Days Wars, West Jerusalem was occupied, and East Jerusalem partly, but a lot of houses were changed. So, for instance, Khadir her family used to live on the other side, but they were displaced in 1948. And for her, it's hard to go back to these original houses because there's all Israeli citizens. Well, it used to be family houses. But so on one side, you feel like there are Palestinian architecture, but on the other side, it's hidden. And so there's a big issue with how houses look from the outside and how things look from the inside. And to her, like the moment you step into a Palestinian house or you meet a Palestinian family, then like all the colors appear and they become visible, and like you never see that you never see it at your first impression. So this ceramic bowl, which was a bowl that existed, she completely painted from the inside instead of from the outside. So it's a very simple act, but the fact that like what led her to make this design, it becomes a powerful and personal story. So this is one of the ceramic bowls, and this is how it's made. This is a T-shirt called "I'm an Arab" T-shirt, and it's a poem by Mahmoud Darwish, who I mentioned before because he was being sung by Marcel Khalif when we started the lecture. And this poem is called "I'm an Arab," and it's written as if Mahmoud Darwish answers a soldier at a checkpoint who's asking, "Who are you?" And then he says, "I'm an Arab. I'm born then and then. I have so many children. I grew up there. I have 7 children. The 8th is coming. They're named like this and this." And so he kind of responds his whole identity. And then the designers decided to use this poem and to write the full poem, and then in the design of a fingerprint. Oh. Oh, no, I wanted to show a detailed image of it. But it's Arabic calligraphy. But what's nice is that it's also, I mean, being an Arab at this time is not always an easy thing because there's a lot of discrimination and misrepresentation of Arabs. So this T-shirt is also kind of showing proud, like, hey, I'm an Arab. And then this T-shirt became quite popular, and it's designed by Hadja Hasbunova, a Palestinian fashion designer, Yaroslav Toussaint, a German designer, and Jale Isid, who did the writing. And then this is Nadia Hasbunova, the Palestinian fashion designer, and she has her own shop and her own fashion collection. And everything that is being developed during the workshop is always with shared copyright. So the designers also have the right to produce the products further, and we have the right to take them in production. And for instance, Nadia produced this T-shirt, and you can see it on the background. And now it's one of her best-selling T-shirts. So participating in the workshop also contributed to her own practice. This is Old News from Palestine bowl. It's by Ahmad Nasser, a Palestinian artist. And what he says is that there's the newspaper, Al-Quds. Al-Quds means Jerusalem in Arabic. And they have a section in this newspaper, and it says the news on the same day, but 20 years ago. So he kept on reading this part in the newspaper, but he also got very disappointed. He said it's the same news. Nothing changed. It's the same news repeating itself. It's still about soldiers, about occupation, and situation doesn't really change. So he said, I'm doing something useful with the newspaper. And then he makes these papier-mâché bowls out of it. And then we call them Old News from Palestine. This is a watchtowers and water tank games by a Dutch designer, Mark-Jan van Tellingen, together with local artisans. And it's the shape of a chessboard, but it's on it is water tanks and watchtowers, but you cannot play the game because the board is completely occupied. And this is Jack Nasrallah, who is actually producing the pieces. These are the Awakening goggles. It's a design by Tessel Brul, a Dutch designer. And they're goggles to put on your head. And they show the eyes of the artisans who make them. And these goggles, they're actually made in Gaza, in Khan Yunis. And so the artisans made a photo of their own eyes. We translated them to embroidery patterns, and then they embroider it and make the goggles. And so at one side it's a sleeping mask, but it's called Awakening goggles. So it's a sleeping mask to make you feel awake or to remind you of the situation that is taking place. But the women in Gaza, they are not allowed to leave Gaza. They are completely locked there. So their eyes can never see anything beyond Gaza. But through the sleeping mask, their eyes can travel and see other worlds. But when we look through the eyes of the women, we see nothing. And here you see them making it. This is Measuring Inequality. It's a water jar by Meerte van Duppe and Helene Underhill, a Dutch and a British designer. And you can see on the water jar that it has 3 measurements. So 500 milliliter, 167 and 117. You can almost see it. And the water jar, so what it's showing is that the middle one, that's this one. So it's not the number is exact. It's exact 160 millimeters, but it talks about the relationship between the three measurements. So the middle one represents the amount that the World Health Organization prescribes for people in the world to have as a minimum amount of water per day. Then the 500 milliliter is what Israeli citizens use on an average per day in comparison with what the World Health Organization prescribes. And then the last one is what Palestinians can use on an average per day. So there's a huge water shortage. And then someone who worked for UNICEF and who works on the water issues in Palestine saw this water jar, and then he got so excited. He says, I speak so much about the water issue in Palestine, but this jar is saying it so much clearer than I can tell. So then he bought it and he uses it in lectures, and he gave it to the director of UNICEF, who then put it on his main desk. And then he wrote me this, and you see his quote there. So he says, I'm just back from a meeting with UNICEF regional director in Amman. I was impressed to see that he put the jar on the permanent display on his desk, visible for anyone coming to meet with him. This is Poetic Night by Ayat Arafat. And again, it's actually a quote from Mahmoud Darwish. And Ayat says, he's a Palestinian artist, he says the occupation is occupying everything of daily life. It's not just like the distance that you can travel or not, or like where you can build a house or not, or what kind of food you are available to get or not, or have access to or not. It's also in your house, it's also in your dreams and at night. So it also occupies your thoughts at night. And so he wanted to protect his nights. And therefore he often reads poetry before going to sleep. And he made these pillowcases with quotes from poetry that he likes. And then you see Ayat on the right. And then by participating in the workshop, he discovered that as an artist who is used to make unique things, he got excited about making things in addition and producing objects. So then he started his own pillowcase collection, and he started to make an apron and T-shirts. And actually, it really, after this workshop for him, it expanded to a lot of other things. And we just have the pillowcase in our collection. And I'll show you a short video of how the pillowcase is made.
أنا اسمي عايد عرفة، أنا من بيت لحم وبشتغل في الفن بشكل عام. وحبيت إني أحط جزء من جمالية الخط العربي وجمالية المعنى، فما كانش في إشي أحلى بالنسبة لي من قصيدة محمود درويش، من قصيدة مديح الضلع عالي. وهنا أنا أخذت مقطع: كم كنا نحب الأزرق الكحلي لولا ظلنا المكسور فوق البحر. ولما شاركت في Disarming Design كان عندي فكرة إني أسوي خط عربي على الوسائد. بديت أسوي تصاميم للقصيدة، ولما جهزت التصميمين سويت كل واحد على مخدة، وفيما بعد صاروا جاهزين للطباعة وجاهزين كمان للعرض.
And this is Everywhere Palestine. It's a silk scarf that shows landscapes of Palestine, and I'm actually wearing it. So it's by Tariq Salsa, and this is Bet Sahur, close to Bethlehem, and he makes panoramic images of the landscape to be able to surround himself with the landscape. And then another thing I'm also wearing, it's the leaf behind. They are earrings, and these are unique copies of olive leaves. So this is the artisan picks the olive leaves from her garden, surrounds it with plaster, burns out the leaf, then puts silver in it, and takes off the plaster, and that becomes the earring. So each earring is a unique copy of an olive tree leaf. This is the Wait, I just want to show you another video of another thing. This is spiced landscape. The video should explain itself.
أنا محمد بنات فنان حركي فلسطيني برسم بالرمل داخل قوارير الزجاج. حبيت اليوم أرسم من مواد أخرى من اللي هو الزعتر والسمسم والملح والسماق اللي هو عبارة عن أكلة فلسطينية تقدم صباحا مع الشاي. حبيت إني أقدمها بطريقة فنية تعريف السواح والخادمين من الخارج عن منتجاتنا الفلسطينية.
So this is a spice pot of the za'atar, showing the landscape where the wild thyme is coming from, which is the main ingredient of the spices. And this I find very beautiful. It's strawway, so it's glass straws.
مرحبا، أنا آيات من القدس، دارسة بكالوريوس إدارة أعمال وجرافيك ديزاين. البرودكت تبعي كان عبارة عن سترو اللي هي الشمية اللي بنشرب فيها عصير. الفكرة كانت إنه هاي المصاصة أو هاي السترو بتمثل الطريق من مدينة لمدينة تانية بفلسطين. وإحنا تعمدنا إن نعمل فيها مثل فقرات أو شغلات صعبة، إنه ونحن عم نشرب العصير نحس بالصعوبة كيف هو عم يوصل من الكاسة.
And this is the checkpoint bag, which is a backpack to use to go through checkpoints. And here you can see a bit of the production process. I'll tell you the idea behind. But the one on Skype is the designer, and then Ghadir Dajani, who also made this first impression bowl, is our production manager, and she goes to all the artisans to talk with them and to follow up the design processes. And then, so it's not always easy to meet each other. So I like this video because you see like how we each time find ways of developing things, communicating with things, because we also work with artisans on all kind of places. So we send WhatsApp, and then there's the email, and then Ghadir goes or not, or also for instance from Gaza, we cannot take, we can't just send products out of Gaza, so we always need to find someone who's in Gaza who's willing to take the products with him or her in his or her suitcase. And so like this whole project is completely also based on trust and on informal structures and on people willing to help. And I think that's interesting that on one side, like life in Palestine is more complicated than you could ever imagine, but on the other side, like the urge and the creativity to find other solutions or other ways of making things happen is very big. And I think this video is a nice example of one of the ways. And so this is a checkpoint bag, so a lot of, so Arish, who's the designer, she actually lives in Jerusalem. So she has a Jerusalem ID, but works in the West Bank. So she constantly has to go through the checkpoint between Ramallah and Jerusalem. It's Columbia checkpoint, which is not a nice experience to go through. And there's often it's busy, you're treated like animals. So she wanted to do something with this experience, and then decided to make a bag, and together with two international designers, to make a bag, to make it as easy as possible to cross the checkpoints, and by making it as easy as possible to tell something about the experience. And here you can see Arish going through the checkpoints with the bag. So this is something she has to do every day, and she, this is Arish, the designer. And actually it's illegal to film in the checkpoint, so she's also a little bit nervous, but then the other people are filming her. And then this is how you need to wait. And then so the special thing about the checkpoint bag is that you hold it like this, and then the pockets are vertical, so you can easily put all your metal things in it. And then there's a surprise coming. And then so all the design decisions were based on the experience of going through the checkpoint. So then you have to go through this again, and then you go through the X-ray with your luggage. Then inside the bag is a hidden message with metal that shows this to the security officer. So it's a key as a symbol to the right of return of the Palestinians. And on this way, so to also have this bag as a form of resistance, but on a gentle way. So that's the checkpoint bag. So right now we have a collection of around 60 products that is available online. You can go to the website disarmingdesign.ps and see the products, read about the stories, and see these production videos. We tried to make a production video of all the products, but now are, I think, halfway. We won an award in Belgium. And then there's different pop-up shops where we sell the products, or exhibitions where we show the products. So this was in Wormels van Beuningen. This is our studio in Ramallah. Where this is our local store, and we also have 2 guest houses. So whenever you are in Ramallah, send us a message, and we have a guest house for you. And I definitely would stimulate you to go to Ramallah. And for you, as with Italian passport, it's really easy to travel around. And Ramallah is an easy place to be, but it really changes your perspective of the situation there. This was last year in Brussels, an exhibition where it was. This was during the Amman Design Week last October, and then it was the output of the workshop that we exhibited there. This is in the Nieuwe Instituut in Rotterdam last November. And this is currently in the Design Museum in Ghent, where we treated the museum as a house. And we called it My House is Your House, as the Palestinians say, welcome. And then you see all the products in this domestic environment. And so now, this is also how we are organized. So we are a Palestinian non-profit company, and we are a Dutch foundation, and with the warehouse and the studio in Brussels. And then we have yearly create shops. And so, like on the left, you see the Disarming Design company that organizes the create shop. We immediately pay the Palestinian producers for their work. And then we work with Palestinian artists and designers, with the Palestinian cultural institutions and international designers. And they bring in ideas, they bring in knowledge of ideas. Then we give those ideas to the producers, they produce it, they give it to the design company, we pay them for their service, then the company sells it on the Palestinian market, and then the foundation sells it on the international market. For instance, if you have Palestinian bank accounts, you cannot connect it to a web shop, so you need to have an international bank account in order to connect it to a web shop. But then our web shop does not allow credit cards, because the credit card company says, hey, there's Palestine in your company. And I say, yeah, but it's a Dutch bank account, it's a Dutch website. And no, but it has Palestine, and that could be terroristic money, so we do not accept credit card payments on your website. So constantly there's these kind of issues that we face. And that's also a reason why we are these 2 entities. And then we sell it, the Dutch foundation sells on the international market, pays it back to the Palestinian company, and then the Palestinian designers, they receive royalties for the sales of their products. And this is the Disarming Design team, the people who are currently working for Disarming Design. But like they're in Belgium, in Ramallah, in Jerusalem, in Gaza, in Ghent, and we had a Portuguese intern. So actually this is the way we communicate and the way we actually work. So at one side we want to be an independent organization, but on the other side we're completely dependent on all these commercial online tools that make money by us using them. So it's nice to have a web shop, but for every payment we also pay the payment service, the web service, all the other things. So it's constantly also thinking, but how is it constructed? Who's getting the money? And do I agree that this organization or company gets the money, or like do we have a choice or not? So there's a lot of kind of constantly thinking about all these relationships, and so this now I'm on the end of my presentation. So this kind of thinking or this kind of knowledge, I found it for me like super learningful, and I think it's interesting to, as a designer, to be in Palestine and to design things, and also for the Palestinian designers to work together with international designers, but to think about like how do crafts, design, resistance, and poetry relate to each other, and how can we make a curriculum out of that. So right now we try to develop a disarming design school in Palestine, and we're investigating how can we set up a design school, how can we make it sustainable, with what partners can we work, and so we're thinking about setting up a school. It can also work with existing institutions like the academy here, to offer maybe a month curriculum together with the school in collaboration, or in this way to work with other schools and offer a curriculum and develop that further on. So that's for the next years in the next step of the design label. So that was my story. Thank you. I actually also brought all kind of books from the Sandberg Instituut, subjective atlases, and I have a folder for each of you about disarming design from Palestine. Maybe you can help folding it. And perhaps there's questions.
I wanted to know, in your design vision that you shared with us, thank you for sharing with us, how do you consider the aesthetic side? Does it come from the social value of the object or the product, or do you think it's something separate from that?
Well, aesthetics in itself are not a goal, but aesthetics are kind of I mean, things need to look good in balance, but it's not, aesthetic is not kind of a style to put on top of something, but we try to get the quality of the object in itself. But for instance, what I find important, so maybe certain products are quite traditional and not don't have a specific aesthetics, but I think the collection as a total starts to have a certain aesthetics. But part of the reason of presenting it in these museums is that that the audience can see it for its artistic quality and not for victimship, or that you don't get the products because you feel a pity for the Palestinian, but you buy a product because you appreciate the artistic quality of the product. So I don't think about aesthetic as something separate, but I do think about artistic quality, which includes aesthetics.
First of all, thanks Annelys for your presentation, which was so interesting. I'm just curious, like at the very beginning of your presentation, you were mentioning that there are like two parallel worlds somehow which doesn't touch each other, like the artistic or design discourse and then the socio-political one, which quite often is stuck in the same usual rhetoric. And so like looking for alternatives in the artistic field, in the design field, is a way to escape from this discourse, which looks like going around and around with no alternatives. So how can actually the work you're doing have an impact on that political side, which is made of course, different people? So how can you actually bring these issues and these alternatives to the attention of other parties which are not directly involved in the design process or in the participatory processes you are actually developing through your work?
So you mean how does maybe the political message reach the right audience? Yeah. I'm not sure if it's they do spread messages, but in a way the act of making is, I think, also a political act, because you engage with certain topics, and making these things also relate to thinking about how do we relate to each other. And the moment you think about how do we relate to each other, I think that's a political question. Maybe it's also a psychological question, but I think the relation to the other that you do not know, or the other on the street, that's a political question in itself, because that's about how society is shaped and how we deal with each other as a community. So by making these things, the act of making is already maybe the political question of knowledge. And then, so that's one side. So it's through the making, it's contributing to this kind of understanding, or this kind of dealing with design and making, and I hope that inspires somebody's practice. And on the other hand, it's how does the work distribute. So then, for instance, with the subjective atlases, they're consciously printed under Creative Commons. I really stimulate the reproduction of the work. I do not protect the work. Also with the Disarming Design from Palestine, also the people can also distribute the works that they've developed, and we distribute it. I really like to collaborate in these exhibitions. We do not have a marketing budget, but then the institutes that we work with, they have a marketing budget, but they don't have a budget to pay us. But then by having this exhibition, they pay the cost, they have extra marketing, we can have an extra folder. So on this way, the work distributes and reaches audiences that we don't reach ourselves. So it's really constantly collaborating with different institutes and also to think about what is the value or the possibility of an institute to collaborate with, and is this value enough to put so much time and effort in, or what's the balance with it?
Just one more thing, then I pass the word back to the question. As you said, of course, these objects have different value also based on the context. So I was really curious to know how they are perceived and received in the original context in Palestine, and for instance when you present them in Belgium or in...
Well, I think with the products I find it really important that they're well received in Palestine. In a sense, there's well received can be sales, but what I mean as a first thing is how the Palestinians read the object. So with all the workshops, we always have a majority of Palestinians and a minority of internationals, and so their voice and their way of reading objects is really important to continue with the design. During a workshop, I think anything can be said and done, but the choice between something that's developed during the workshop and something that we continue in taking in production, then it becomes a conscious choice and editing, and those are choices I cannot make as an outsider and as an international. So it's really kind of a dialogue that we constantly have to figure out what's the right tone, and also for every product we have a short text. So also we need to see how to describe it, because I don't. Of course, it's a political project, but at the same time, it doesn't say anything about, not directly about Israel. It doesn't say something about directly about politics. So it's always trying to put central the human experience or the human story. So that's important, but it uses humor, and humor is a very tricky thing, because humor can be very funny on one side and awful for somebody else. So this is kind of a dialogue to figure out, are we making the right jokes? And then what we see that in Palestine, it's absolutely embraced. People really love the project, and now it's growing. I think that the products are on an international level not so expensive, although we notice that we have to raise the prices because it's like the transportation, making, like we're far from self-sufficient. While we need to be self-sufficient. And so sometimes, and then in Palestine they're much cheaper, but I think that's definitely, for a regular Palestinian, the products are quite expensive. So that's sometimes a hesitation. But like for instance, now the Palestine Museum wants to organize a workshop with us, and it's a museum that has recently been opened. 2 years ago it was the Ramallah municipality who were invited to collaborate, to set up a workshop together. 3 years ago it was Al Mamal, a cultural institute in Jerusalem. So it is the Palestinians themselves who also approach us to develop it further. So we can really see a big engagement from their side, and also I wouldn't work on it if that wasn't the case. Maybe you can also take the books or show them around. And I have a booklet for all the ones who are still left. I think it's just enough. And this is a story about the workshop that we organized in Jerash. So you can follow a bit what took place, why things are made, and how it's done. And then on a practical note, I don't know if it's the right audience, but I do want to share it with you, that our aim is to become completely financial self-sufficient. The idea is that we become sufficient by the sales of our products, and it's raising and it's improving. So please either buy products yourself or stimulate other people also to get our products. And we're also looking for funders who want to support and sponsors who want to support our project. So I don't expect students who would be in that position, but if you would know someone that you think, wow, that could be a great connection, don't hesitate to bring us in contact with this person. And here's the books from the Sandberg Instituut, and I also have a folder for each of you, which I'm going to fold.
See. Okay, we can close your speech here, Annelys, if you agree, or?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Annelys, for your speech, and to stay with us in these next days. Mm-hmm. And thank you, everybody. And if you want to enjoy us, we got to drink something, I think, a couple of wine. So all of you are invited, okay? Mm-hmm.
And take a folder. Yes. That's why I brought them. But they were all on the table all the time. Yes, this is Sandberg, yeah. So every year we make a yearbook to show a bit what took place throughout the year. Yes, the students make the book and they also do the editing.